More than 520 million years ago, Earth looked like something from another world. On land, there were no trees, grass, or animals. There were only endless red deserts and green shallow seas where evolution was slowly getting ready to take its biggest step forward. That's where eyes opened for the first time. Armor hit armor, and hunters started their hunt. The planet's surface was empty, but life was exploding all around it. The first reefs were being built, the first arms were growing, and the rules of existence were being changed. This is the world we lived in before people walked on it. Everything was ruled by the seas. A planet without green. Earth did not look at all like it does now 520 million years ago. Not a single blade of grass, not a single tree, not a single flower. The land was empty, with miles and miles of rock, hills, and dusty areas that didn't have any green in them. Earth's surface was stained by iron-rich dirt, making it look orange and grey from space. In a harsh, otherworldly way, it was beautiful, a planet that was waiting for colour. The air was different too. It had oxygen, but not much. If you stood there, you couldn't breathe. It would choke your lungs in seconds. The sky wasn't bright blue like today. It was hazy, pale, and washed out by dust and carbon dioxide. The sun shone through a thin veil of clouds that drifted over continents of bare stone. No birds, no sound, only wind. Rain still fell, but when it hit the ground, it ran off quickly. There were no plants to hold the water, no roots to trap the soil. Rivers cut deep scars into the land, carving valleys that were filled with sand and mud. The air was hot and heavy with moisture. Greenhouse gases kept the planet warm, even without forests to trap heat. Life, however, had already begun, just not where you might expect. The land was nearly empty, but the oceans were alive. The seas shimmered in shades of blue-green, filled with tiny specks of plankton and algae. They were the only green that existed anywhere on Earth. If you looked along the shore, you might see strange slimy mats covering the rocks, thick wet carpets of bacteria called microbial mats. They looked like scum, but they were important. They trapped sediments, created oxygen, and helped shape the coastlines. It was peculiar that the continents were odd. Most of them joined together to form Gondwana, a huge island in the south that covered what is now Africa, South America, Antarctica, and Australia. Smaller pieces of land, like Laurentia, which would become North America, and Baltica, which would become Europe, floated close to the equator in warm seas. There weren't any mountains like the Himalayas yet. Instead, there were only low, worn-down slopes and shallow basins. Every gust of wind kicked up fine red dust made of oxidized iron, the same mineral that makes Mars look red today. That dust settled into the seas, giving coastal waters a rusty tint. Storms blew hard and often, shaping dunes and eroding cliffs. Without plants, erosion was fast. Rock crumbled, sand moved freely, and nothing stopped the chaos of wind and rain. Even so, the air was slowly changing. Tiny organisms in the sea, mostly cyanobacteria, had spent millions of years releasing oxygen through photosynthesis. They were invisible to the naked eye, but their work was world-changing. Bit by bit, they filled the atmosphere with oxygen, allowing larger and more complex life to form under the waves. If you stood on one of those barren shores, you'd see something incredible. Beyond the silence of the land, the shallow sea glittered with movement. Strange shapes drifted just below the surface. Soft-bodied animals, some flat, some long and thin, others covered in spines. They swam slowly through the light, leaving trails in the sand. It was a sign of what was coming, Earth's first explosion of complex life. The warm, shallow seas of life. If the land was empty, the seas were full of things. About 520 million years ago, most living things on Earth were underwater. The ocean should not be deep and dark. Instead, it should be warm and sunny near the shore. The water was calm, shining blue-green in the hot sun, full of oxygen and moving all the time. Here, the seafloor was covered with fine mud and sand. Waves rolled gently over it, stirring up tiny food particles that drifted through the water. To us, it would look peaceful, but to early sea creatures, it was paradise. The shallow seas were the perfect environment for evolution to start creating complex life. Most animals here were small, no bigger than your hand, but they were unlike anything alive today. Worms wriggled through the mud, leaving little tunnels that hardened into fossils. Jellyfish-like blobs floated near the surface, pulsing gently as they followed sunlight. At the bottom, creatures with shells, spines, and armor crawled slowly, feeding on whatever drifted down. These were Earth's first true animals, testing new shapes and ideas that would change life forever. Sunlight made everything possible. The top few meters of the ocean were warm and full of algae and bacteria, microscopic plants that released oxygen into the water. This was the air supply of the ancient seas, the reason animals could grow larger and move faster. Deeper down, the light faded, and the water turned dark green and cold. Down there, only the hardiest worms and scavengers could survive. The ocean floor itself was not smooth. It was full of tiny hills, coral-like mounds and patches of microbial mats, slippery layers of bacteria that trapped silt and made the surface sticky. Some creatures learned to live inside these mats, digging small holes for protection. Others, like early sponges, anchored themselves to the seafloor and filtered water for food. They looked simple, but they were building the first food webs, tiny systems of predator and prey that would shape evolution for millions of years. If you could dive into one of these Cambrian seas, you'd see an alien world. The water would shimmer with plankton, and strange animals would drift past, some with eyes on stalks, others with dozens of legs, or soft fin-like flaps for swimming. Nothing was standardized yet. Evolution was still experimenting. Every creature seemed to have its own strange idea of what life should look like. The water temperature was warm, around 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and rich in dissolved minerals. Volcanic activity was common, releasing nutrients that fed the growing ecosystems. Storms stirred up the shallows, mixing fresh oxygen into the water, and when the waves settled, they left behind layers of fine sediment, perfectly preserving the tracks, shells, and bodies of the creatures that lived there. These sediments would one day become famous fossil sites, like the Burgess Shale in Canada and the Chengjiang beds in China. Among the algae and sponges, the first predators appeared. Some were small worms that hunted by smell or touch. Others floated near the surface and used tiny bristles to grab food. These were the ancestors of future giants, the early prototypes of crabs, lobsters, and insects. For the first time, life had both hunters and hunted, beginning an endless race for survival. Every tide brought something new. Dead creatures sank to the bottom and became food for scavengers. Bacteria feed on decay, releasing nutrients back into the water. It was a self-sustaining loop, energy flowing from sunlight to algae to animals. This was Earth's first real ecosystem, and it worked beautifully. The birth of animal eyes. Life was blind before eyes were made. Life on Earth was based on touch, smell, and luck for billions of years. As they swam through the water, they ran into food or danger without notice. Things changed, though, about 520 million years ago. Evolution created sight in the warm seas of the Cambrian period. As soon as animals could see, the rules of life changed. The first eyes weren't like ours. They were simple spots of light-sensitive cells, just able to tell light from dark. But that tiny advantage meant everything. If you could sense when something passed above you, you could dive to safety. If you could tell where light was coming from, you could move toward it, toward food, warmth, or escape. Evolution quickly took that idea and ran with it. Scientists believed that the first true eyes appeared in small, soft-bodied animals like early worms and jellyfish. Over time, those light patches became deeper, forming cup-shaped pits that could detect movement. Then, tiny lenses evolved, made from clear proteins that focused light. Suddenly, animals could see shapes, then detail, then motion. The best example of this transformation is the trilobite, one of the ocean's earliest armored animals. Fossils show that trilobites had compound eyes, hundreds of tiny lenses packed together like a fly's eye. Each lens was made of clear calcite crystal, a natural material strong enough to survive for 500 million years. Through these lenses, trilobites could see predators coming, track food, and navigate the sea floor. In some species, the eyes even had built-in prisms to correct light underwater, a feature so advanced that modern optics still marvels at it. But the arrival of eyes didn't just change how creatures moved, it changed how they lived. The ocean suddenly became a world of hunters and hunted. Vision made speed, camouflage and armor necessary for survival. Soft-bodied worms developed spines, predators grew sharper claws and fins for chasing. This new visual arms race triggered the Cambrian explosion, a burst of new animal types in just a few million years. Before eyes, evolution moved slowly. One of the most important fossils showing this revolution is Anomalocaris, a giant predator that ruled the Cambrian seas. Its large, complex eyes had thousands of lenses, even more than modern dragonflies. It could spot prey meters away in dim water. Scientists think it hunted by sight alone, scanning the seafloor for trilobites to grab with its spiked arms. In a world of half-blind prey, a creature with true vision was unstoppable. On the other end of the scale, prey evolved to fight back. Some trilobites flattened their bodies to blend with the sand. Others developed reflective eyes that caught light differently, making them harder to spot. Even simple animals like sponges began building reefs that offered cover. Sight changed not just individuals, it reshaped entire ecosystems. Fossils from the Burgess Shale in Canada and the Chengjiang site in China preserve eyes so clearly that scientists can still see the microscopic pattern of lenses. Some species had crescent-shaped eyes on stalks for 360-degree vision. Others had simple forward-facing ones for tunnel vision, perfect for chasing food. Every new type of eye told evolution a new story about how to live, hunt, and survive. The chemistry of sight also began here. Early eyes used light-sensitive molecules called opsins, the same kind found in your eyes today. These molecules capture light and send signals to the brain. Over time, evolution fine-tuned them, creating color vision, night vision, and depth perception. But their first job was simple: to break the darkness. If you could have floated in those Cambrian seas, you'd have seen it happening. Tiny flashes of movement as animals started reacting to light, eyes glittering under the sun, creatures turning towards shadows or darting away from danger. It would have been the first true visual drama on Earth. Trilobites, the original rulers of the seafloor. Trilobites were the protected kings of the ocean floor. They existed before fish, crabs, and anything else with bones or scales. These animals ruled the shallow seas like robots about 520 million years ago. They were small, tough, and all over the place. If you could stand on the edge of a Cambrian beach and look down into the water, you would have seen them moving in all directions, scuttling, burrowing, feeding, and mating. They were like a shell-eating invasion of life that spread all over the world. A trilobite looked like a cross between a horseshoe crab and a pillbug. Its body was divided into three parts: a head, a segmented middle, and a tail, all protected by a hard exoskeleton made of calcium carbonate. This armor wasn't just for defense, it was also practical. When a trilobite grew, it had to shed its shell, leaving behind perfect molds of its body. That's why we find so many trilobite fossils today. Each one may have left dozens of ghost shells in its lifetime. Some trilobites were no bigger than a fingernail, while others grew as long as a house cat. Most crawled along the seafloor, feeding on detritus and tiny organic particles. Others swam just above the sand, fluttering their jointed legs like paddles. Some could even roll up into tight balls like modern pillbugs when threatened. Evolution gave them every trick needed to survive, and for nearly 270 million years, they did exactly that. But what made trilobites truly advanced for their time were their eyes. They were among the first animals to develop complex vision. Their compound eyes were made of hundreds of tiny lenses, carved from clear mineral crystal, a natural marvel that let them detect predators and navigate the dim blue-green light of the sea. Some species even had eyes that could see 360 degrees, with raised lenses on stalks that peeked over the sand like miniature periscopes. The seafloor during this era was a busy place. The mud was alive with worm burrows, microbial mats, and trails left by crawling trilobites. In fossil beds like the Burgess Shale in Canada and the Wheeler Formation in Utah, you can still see their tracks. Parallel lines pressed into the ancient mud, frozen for 500 million years. These traces are like timestamps from the first ecosystem engineers, showing how early animals started shaping their environment long before plants ever took root on land. Trilobites weren't all the same either. Evolution splintered them into hundreds of families, each adapted to a different role. Some had wide, flat bodies perfect for gliding across sand. Others developed spines and horns for defense. A few became deep-sea drifters, losing their heavy armor to float freely in the water column. There were trilobites that sifted mud for food, trilobites that hunted tiny worms, and trilobites that lived symbiotically with other creatures. It was an empire built on diversity, and like all rulers, they had enemies. In the Cambrian seas, predators like Anomalocaris hunted them relentlessly. Its spiked arms were designed to grab and crush the trilobite's shells. Fossils even show bite marks where trilobite armor was cracked open like nutshells. But the trilobites evolved back. Thicker shells, faster legs, better eyesight. The predator-prey arms race that began between them would drive evolution for the next 100 million years. Their lifestyle also helped shape the planet itself. As trilobites crawled and dug, they churned up the seabed, recycling nutrients and oxygenating the mud. This bioturbation process made the oceans healthier and more stable, just as earthworms later did for soil. They were not just inhabitants of their world, they were its caretakers. For almost 300 million years, trilobites dominated Earth's oceans. Then, slowly, they faded. New predators, changing seas, and falling oxygen levels pushed them toward extinction. The last trilobites vanished during the Great Permian die-off, long after the Cambrian seas had disappeared. Anomalocaris, the first apex predator. The hunter was so strange that experts used to think its body parts belonged to 3 different species. This was a long time before sharks took over the seas. In the Cambrian era, Anomalocaris was the most dangerous animal in the seas and the first real top hunter on Earth. Even though its name means weird shrimp, this animal wasn't at all like a shrimp. It was more than a meter long, smooth, quick, and made to kill. No one had ever seen a hunter like it before. Picture the shallow oceans 520 million years ago. Soft-bodied creatures drifting slowly. Trilobites crawling on the seafloor. Algae swaying in the sunlight. Then, out of the haze, Anomalocaris appears. A torpedo-shaped animal with giant spiny arms extending from its head. These arms could grab prey like claws, bringing it toward a circular mouth lined with hard, jagged plates. When it struck, the prey didn't stand a chance. It was like being caught between rotating blades. For centuries, fossils of Anomalocaris confused scientists. Its mouth was first discovered alone and mistaken for a jellyfish. Its spiny arms were thought to belong to shrimp. Only when complete fossils were found in the Burgess Shale in Canada did the truth emerge. All those parts were from one incredible creature. When paleontologists pieced it together, they realized they had found the earliest large predator ever known. Anomalocaris wasn't just big for its time. It was built for speed. Its long, flexible body had overlapping lobes that rippled like the fins of a cuttlefish, letting it glide effortlessly through the water. It could maneuver with precision, darting after prey or cruising above the seabed in search of movement. 2 large compound eyes sat on stalks above its head, giving it a panoramic view of its world. Each eye had over 16,000 lenses, similar to modern dragonflies, making it one of the sharpest eyes of the entire Cambrian period. What did it hunt? Mostly trilobites and soft-bodied worms. The hard-shelled trilobites were tough, but Anomalocaris had ways to deal with them. It grabbed them with its claws, flipped them over to expose their softer bellies, and then crushed them with its circular mouth. Some trilobite fossils even show crescent-shaped bite marks, likely made by Anomalocaris teeth. In a sea full of slow grazers, it was a nightmare that came with precision tools. Its mouth, called an oral cone, was one of evolution's strangest inventions. It was ring-shaped, like a pineapple slice, with plates that opened and closed in a rotating motion. Inside, serrated edges tore flesh apart. This was not a clumsy hunter. It was a machine built for the chase, an animal that combined agility, intelligence, and raw power long before vertebrates even existed. For smaller creatures, there was no defense. They had no shells strong enough, no speed to escape. The rise of Anomalocaris forced evolution to respond. Prey species started developing thicker armor, burrowing habits, and even primitive camouflage. Scientists believe this predator-prey pressure helped trigger the Cambrian explosion, the sudden burst of new animal forms. In short, Anomalocaris didn't just rule its world, it reshaped it. Despite its fearsome design, it eventually disappeared, probably around 480 million years ago. As the oceans changed and more advanced hunters evolved, like early fish with jaws, Anomalocaris and its relatives couldn't compete, but their role as pioneers of predation left an unshakable legacy. They showed that hunting could drive innovation, pushing evolution to invent better armor, faster movement, and smarter senses. If you could swim beside one, you'd feel its power immediately. Its body would move like a living ribbon, gliding with effortless grace. Its eyes would lock onto you from meters away, and when it opened that ringed mouth, you'd see the first blueprint of the predator's face, a design evolution would copy for millions of years to come. Opabinia, the five-eyed enigma. You might think you were seeing things if you could dive into the Cambrian seas and see Opabinia for the first time. For some reason, this thing seemed like it was either made by accident or by an alien with a mean streak. Its body was long and soft, and its tail was shaped like a fan. It had 5 eyes on stalks that looked like tiny periscopes, and its stiff trunk ended in a claw. It didn't look like anything else on Earth, and experts aren't sure where it fits in the tree of life even now. This creature looked like it had been built by mistake, or by an alien with a strange sense of humor. It had a long, soft body, a fan-shaped tail, 5 eyes sitting on stalks like tiny periscopes, and a flexible trunk ending in a claw. Nothing else on Earth looked remotely like it. And even today, scientists still aren't fully sure where it fits in the tree of life. Opabinia regalis was small, only about 7 centimeters long, but it was one of the most bizarre animals to ever exist. Its body was divided into many segments, each with little flaps that helped it swim gently above the sea floor. But it wasn't built for speed. It moved slowly, gliding just above the sediment, searching for food with its trunk. That trunk, or proboscis, was its defining feature. Imagine an elephant's trunk, but thin and flexible, ending in a claw-like pincer. Opabinia used it like a grabber arm, reaching into the sand to pull out worms or bits of decaying matter, and then curling the food into its backward-facing mouth, which was tucked underneath its head. Its 5 eyes made it even stranger. 2 were larger and pointed forward, while the others faced sideways or upward, giving it almost a 360-degree view of its surroundings. Some scientists think these eyes helped it stay alert for danger, since predators like Anomalocaris ruled the waters above. Others believe it used them to detect motion from prey hiding beneath the sand. In either case, those 5 eyes made it one of the most visually advanced creatures of its time. When the first fossils of Opabinia were discovered in the Burgess Shale of Canada in the early 1900s, scientists didn't know what to make of them. At the time, paleontologists were still learning what the Cambrian seas even looked like. When the creature was first reconstructed in 1912, the audience at the Royal Society reportedly laughed, not out of disrespect, but disbelief. The drawing showed something that looked like a swimming vacuum cleaner with 5 eyes and a garden hose for a nose. But the fossils were real, and later research confirmed that the strange design wasn't an error. Evolution really had created something that looked impossible. Unlike trilobites or Anomalocaris, Opabinia had no hard shell or teeth. Its body was soft and flexible, preserved only in fine mud that captured every detail. This softness means it rarely fossilized, but when it did, the results were astonishingly detailed, showing even the outlines of its flaps, gills, and eyes. Those fossils gave scientists their first deep look at what early soft-bodied animals were like before shells and skeletons became common. Opabinia is considered a close relative of the ancestors of arthropods, the group that includes insects, crabs, and spiders today. It shows what evolution looked like before the blueprints of modern body plans were locked in. Its trunk may have been an early experiment that would later evolve into the antennae or feeding appendages of later creatures. In other words, Opabinia was one of evolution's rough drafts, weird, creative, and surprisingly functional. Its world was quiet, but dangerous. The seafloor was a battlefield of ambush predators, scavengers, and grazers. Opabinia's best defense was awareness. Its eyes scanned constantly, and its flexible body allowed it to twist and dart into small spaces. It likely spent its life close to the sediment, feeding carefully and avoiding attention. Despite its strange appearance, it was well adapted for its environment, a creature perfectly balanced between caution and curiosity. To modern scientists, Opabinia is more than just a fossil oddity. It represents the incredible variety of life's early experiments. Evolution didn't move in straight lines back then. It branched wildly, trying out shapes, limbs, and senses that would never appear again. The fact that Opabinia existed at all shows how flexible life can be when it's still figuring itself out. You probably would have laughed too if you could go back to that time and see it slip by in the dim light. Not because it was funny, but because it was so amazing. It works even though it looks silly. Opabinia did very well in that strange world below the waves. Each of its 5 eyes blinked on its own, and its trunk curled carefully. At one point in Earth's past, something so strange and one of a kind felt right at home. Hallucigenia, the spiked worm that shouldn't exist. With all the strange animals that lived in the Cambrian seas, Hallucigenia was one of the most puzzling and strange. This worm is only about an inch long, but it looks like it was drawn by a child after a bad dream. It's long and thin, covered in spikes, and its legs are soft and finger-like. Its head is so small that it doesn't even look like a head. The scientists named it Hallucigenia sparsa because when they saw it for the first time, they thought it had to be a dream. The story of Hallucigenia is almost as strange as the creature itself. When its fossils were first found in the Burgess Shale of Canada in the 1970s, researchers were sure they'd put it together correctly. Spines on the bottom, legs on top. It looked like a worm walking upside down on stilts. Decades later, better fossils from China's Chengjiang site revealed the truth. The original reconstruction had been flipped. The stilts were actually spines on its back for protection, and the floppy tentacles underneath were its legs. Paleontologists had literally been studying it upside down for years. Once corrected, Hallucigenia began to make a bit more sense, though only a bit. It had a long, soft body divided into segments, with 7 pairs of thin legs ending in tiny claws that let it grip the sea floor. Above those legs, sharp spines stuck out like spears, probably to stop predators like Anomalocaris from swallowing it. Its head was tiny, barely wider than the body, with 2 simple eyes and a circular mouth full of needle-like teeth. It looked fragile, but in the slow-moving, experimental world of the Cambrian, it was tough enough to survive. Scientists now think Hallucigenia was a distant ancestor of modern velvet worms, small, soft-bodied hunters that still live in tropical forests today. That connection helped paleontologists understand what Hallucigenia was doing with all those weird parts. The claws on its feet, for example, were similar in shape to the hooks that velvet worms use to cling to surfaces. Its spines may have been flexible enough to sway, making it hard for predators to grab. Even its tiny teeth made sense. They likely helped it suck in food or scrape bacteria and algae from the seafloor. The intriguing aspect about Hallucigenia is how different it looks from modern life. It serves as a warning that evolution doesn't happen in a straight line. It tries new things, adapts to new situations, and sometimes makes things that are so strange that they disappear after their time in the sun. One of those tests was hallucinogens. While it wasn't meant to last forever, the way it was made worked well enough for its time. Fossils show that Hallucigenia lived alongside other Cambrian oddities like Opabinia and Wiwaxia. These creatures shared the same ecosystem, crawling, gliding, and drifting over microbial mats that carpeted the ocean floor. In that world, survival didn't depend on being big or fast. It depended on being unique enough to find your own niche, and Hallucigenia had that covered, literally in spikes. The discovery of better fossils in the 2010s changed even more about how scientists understood it. Under powerful microscopes, researchers found that Hallucigenia's tiny teeth were arranged in rings not only around its mouth, but also deep inside its throat, the first sign of a specialized feeding system. Its claws were made of a material called chitin, the same stuff that makes up insect shells today. These details revealed that Hallucigenia was part of the early lineage that would one day lead to arthropods, the most successful group of animals in history, including crabs, spiders, and insects. So even though it looks absurd, Hallucigenia is part of our biological family tree. Its spikes, claws, and mouth rings were all early versions of traits that would later dominate the animal kingdom. It was weird, yes, but it was a pioneer of weirdness. If you could see it alive, you might think it was fragile or helpless. But picture it gliding slowly over the seafloor, its spines flashing in the light, its soft legs rippling like a wave. It didn't need speed or strength, just enough defense to survive and enough curiosity to move forward. For a creature that looked impossible, hallucigenia did what all great survivors do. It adapted, thrived, and left its mark on history. Wiwaxia, the living armor. There was something that looked like a living piece of armor in the dark waters of the Cambrian seas, among the trilobites that crawled and the worms that drifted. It was named Wiwaxia, and it looked more like a weapon from the Middle Ages than an animal at first. Its back had rows of scales that overlapped, like fish armor made of tiny metal plates. There were also long, sharp spines growing between the scales. But under that tough shell was a soft slug-like body that moved slowly across the ocean bottom. Wiwaxia wasn't large, about as long as your finger, but it was one of the most well-protected creatures of its time. Its body was shielded by hundreds of small scales made of chitin, the same tough material found in modern insect shells. These scales glistened under the water like metal, forming a kind of natural armor against the predators of the Cambrian. Above the armor, rows of flexible spines curved outward like antennae, probably warning larger hunters such as Anomalocaris to stay away. One bite into that bristling shield would have been a painful mistake. It lived on the sea floor, where the mud was thick with bacteria, algae, and tiny bits of organic matter. Wiwaxia was likely a grazer, using a tongue-like structure called a radula, a rasping organ found in modern snails, to scrape food from microbial mats. It would glide slowly, dragging its armored body just above the sediment, leaving faint trails behind it. Those trails, preserved as trace fossils, show that even simple movements from small animals could shape the seafloor ecosystem in lasting ways. When Wiwaxia was first discovered in the Burgess Shale fossil beds of Canada, scientists didn't know what to make of it. Was it a worm? A mollusk? Some kind of early arthropod? Its strange mix of features confused paleontologists for decades. It had the soft underside of a worm, the feeding tool of a snail, and the armor of an insect. Eventually, researchers realized it was probably an early experiment in building body protection, a distant cousin of both worms and mollusks. Evolution was trying out new designs, and Wiwaxia happened to be one that worked. Its fossils are remarkably detailed. Under a microscope, you can see the structure of each scale, thin, flattened plates overlapping like shingles on a roof. They would have reflected light in shimmering patterns, making the animal appear almost metallic in the shallow sunlit waters. This might have helped it blend in with the glittering sediment below, or confuse predators that relied on sight to hunt. Its spines, on the other hand, were likely stiff but flexible, curving backward to make swallowing it nearly impossible. Although slow and unassuming, Wiwaxia was part of a much larger story, the arms race of the Cambrian. As predators like Anomalocaris evolved sharper vision and faster attacks, prey species responded by building tougher defenses. Armor, spines, shells, and camouflage all began appearing in this era, and Wiwaxia was one of the first to show how effective armor could be. This back-and-forth struggle between predator and prey would drive evolution for hundreds of millions of years. Life at the time was still small, but it was already learning the lessons that would shape the rest of Earth's history: protection, adaptation, and innovation. Wiwaxia's armor was a prototype of what would later become shells, scales, and even exoskeletons, tools that animals still rely on today. In a way, it was one of the planet's first armored vehicles, moving through a world that was just beginning to discover conflict. If you could have seen one alive, it would have looked both beautiful and bizarre. Picture a slow-moving slug covered in mirror-like scales, its spines catching light as it crawled across a soft seabed. Tiny particles of silt would have drifted over its back as it grazed peacefully, unaware that its kind were teaching evolution how to defend itself. Morella, the tiny survivor of Burgess Shale. Big hunters and armored crawlers lived in the same world as Morella, which was only about the size of a paperclip. However, it left behind one of the most valuable and thorough fossil records ever found. With feathery legs, thin antennae, and a body so thin that its remains show features smaller than a human hair, it was very delicate. Even so, Morella splendens was one of the most successful animals of its time. It lived in the old seas that filled what is now British Columbia, and did very well. When Charles Walcott first discovered the Burgess Shale fossils in 1909, Morella was among the first animals he found. At first, he He thought it might be a kind of trilobite. It had a segmented body, jointed legs, and even a hard exoskeleton. But it didn't quite fit. Its head was strange, shaped like a rounded shield with two long sweeping spines extending backward like horns. Its antennae were far too long, and its legs were covered in delicate feather-like filaments. It didn't match anything known at the time. Walcott labeled it as an odd lace crab and moved on. But decades later, scientists realized it was something entirely unique, a creature that didn't belong to any living group. Marella was an early arthropod, part of the same vast family that would eventually include crabs, insects, and spiders. But unlike its descendants, it had no defined category. It was one of nature's earliest experiments in building jointed limbs and segmented armor, a design that would later dominate the animal kingdom. In a way, Marella was a prototype, a glimpse into how arthropods first began to take shape. It lived on the ocean floor, moving gently over the mud and detritus that blanketed the Cambrian shallows. Its feathery limbs helped it walk, stir sediment, and even breathe by filtering oxygen directly from the water. Some scientists think it was a scavenger, feeding on tiny bits of organic matter that floated down from above. Others believe it may have been a filter feeder, fanning its limbs to catch microscopic food particles. Either way, it lived quietly in the shadows of larger creatures like trilobites and Anomalocaris, surviving by staying unnoticed. Marella is unique not only because of how it looked, but also because of how well it was kept. In the Burgess Shale, fossils found even the smallest parts of its body, like the hairs and soft tissue on its limbs. For a creature that lived more than 500 million years ago, it is very rare to be able to see features of its gills, eyes, and digestive system under a microscope. Scientists found that the Cambrian seas were much more advanced than they had been thought. These fossils gave them a look into the oldest forms of life that were very complicated. The eyes of Marella were small but sophisticated for its size. Positioned high on its head, they allowed it to scan for movement, a crucial defense against predators. Its body, divided into 24 segments, ended in a fan-like tail that helped it swim short distances when disturbed. But it wasn't built for speed. Its real advantage was adaptability. Fossils of Marella have been found in huge numbers, suggesting it could survive in many conditions: warm or cool, calm or stormy waters. That flexibility may be why it outlasted so many other Cambrian creatures. Despite its simple look, Marella represents one of evolution's greatest turning points: the rise of the arthropod body plan. Everything from dragonflies to lobsters carries the same blueprint that Marella helped pioneer: jointed limbs, hard exoskeletons, segmented bodies, and sensory antennae. This basic design has been so successful that it still rules Earth's animal life today, both on land and in the sea. But there's another reason Marella remains iconic. It survived when others didn't. While so many Cambrian creatures came and went, vanishing forever as the seas changed, Marella's lineage lived on through its evolutionary cousins. Every beetle crawling through the dirt or shrimp gliding through coral reefs today carries a shadow of its DNA. The oxygen revolution underwater. Something that couldn't be seen had already started to change the world a long time before the Cambrian explosion brought strange, active animals to the seas. It wasn't eyes, claws, or shells. It was air. None of those things would have been possible without it. One of the most important turning points in Earth's history was the oxygen revolution. It turned the seas from a calm chemical soup into a living, moving world full of energy and motion. Oxygen didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was made by tiny, microscopic organisms called cyanobacteria, which lived in the oceans for billions of years before the Cambrian period. These bacteria performed photosynthesis, the same process that plants use today, taking in sunlight and releasing oxygen as a waste product. At first, most of that oxygen was absorbed by iron in the oceans, creating rusty red rocks known as banded iron formations. Only after the iron was used up did oxygen begin to collect in the atmosphere and water, setting the stage for complex life. By 520 million years ago, oxygen levels had risen enough to change everything. It allowed animals to grow larger, move faster, and develop organs that needed high energy, like muscles and nervous systems. The warm, shallow seas became oxygen-rich nurseries where evolution could run wild. For the first time, life had fuel, and it used it well. In those early seas, Creatures like trilobites, morella, and wiwaxia depended on oxygen not only for survival, but for innovation. Breathing more oxygen meant their bodies could build stronger shells and move more efficiently. Some animals developed gills to filter oxygen directly from the water, while others evolved circulatory systems to carry it throughout their bodies. It was like evolution had discovered a new power source, and every creature was finding its own way to use it. The difference between oxygen-poor and oxygen-rich waters was dramatic. In low-oxygen zones, often near the muddy seabed, life was sparse. Only simple worms and bacteria could survive there, feeding on decaying matter. But in the sunlit layers above, where oxygen mixed freely, the ocean teemed with activity. Plankton bloomed, small grazers fed on them, and predators began to hunt. It was the first real food web, an interconnected system of life powered by oxygen and sunlight. Scientists studying the chemistry of Cambrian rocks can actually see this transformation. In some layers, iron and sulfur minerals show evidence of oxygen-rich water. In others, the signs of oxygen vanish, replaced by elements that form only in stagnant oxygen-depleted zones. These alternating layers reveal how unstable early oxygen levels were, rising and falling with changing climates and ocean circulation. Yet even during the lows, enough oxygen remained for evolution to keep moving forward. The oxygen revolution also changed the color and chemistry of the seas. Before oxygen became common, the oceans were greenish and murky, filled with dissolved iron and sulfur. As oxygen increased, it reacted with those elements, removing the haze and clearing the water. The seas turned blue. This clarity lets sunlight reach deeper, feeding photosynthetic life and creating new habitats. It was a chain reaction. More oxygen meant more light, more algae, more food, and more animals. Some scientists think the rise of oxygen also triggered the Cambrian explosion itself. Once the planet's energy budget increased, evolution had the room to create new complex body plans. Muscles, shells, and brains all require lots of oxygen to function. Without it, even the simplest movements would have been impossible. Oxygen didn't just make life possible, it made activity possible. The oxygen revolution also affected the climate. As oxygen levels rose, carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, decreased. This cooled the planet slightly, making it more stable. Storms became less violent, temperatures more consistent, and ocean circulation improved. The stage was set for long-term ecological balance, giving life the time it needed to evolve steadily. The seas had really come to life by the end of this change. The unseen thread that linked all living things, from germs to trilobites to us, was oxygen. Breath changed chemistry into biology, and biology into history. The world learned how to breathe, and with that first breath, all the options for life grew infinitely. Microbial mats and slimy continents. The land on Earth looked empty before there were woods, grass, or even moss, but it wasn't totally lifeless. If you could go back in time 520 million years and stand on one of the continents, the ground would be slippery and green. These were microbial mats, which are rugs made of bacteria and algae that are alive. They clung to the beach, hugged the rocks, and filled the tide pools. They would look like a mix of mold and jelly to us. But to the Earth when it was young, they were the first step in turning stone into land that could live on. Microbial mats were made mostly of cyanobacteria, tiny organisms that used sunlight to create energy and release oxygen. These same microbes had already changed the atmosphere once, filling it with the oxygen that powered the Cambrian explosion in the oceans. On land, they were doing it again on a smaller scale. Their slimy layers trapped dust, minerals, and bits of organic matter, slowly building up soft patches of sediment. Over time, these mats began to shape the landscape, holding soil together and creating the first stable coastlines. They came in many textures and colors, green from chlorophyll, purple from light-sensitive pigments, even orange and red from iron-rich minerals. In the sunlight, they shimmered like wet paint. When tides came in, they survived underwater. When the sea retreated, they stayed moist for days, waiting patiently for the next wave. Some stretched for miles along shorelines, forming thick, rubbery sheets that looked almost alive, because they were. Beneath the surface, each mat was a miniature world. Layers of different microbes lived stacked on top of one another, each performing a specific job. The top layers photosynthesized, turning sunlight into food. The middle layers broke down waste, while the deeper ones processed minerals and gases. Together, they formed ecosystems only a few millimeters thick, but millions of years ahead of their time. They didn't move, but they built the foundations for everything that would come later. When small waves or winds blew across the surface, the mats trapped sand and silt, forming rippled patterns that hardened into rock. These patterns, called wrinkle structures, can still be found in ancient stone today. Proof that life existed long before trees or animals set foot on land. They're like the earliest footprints of Earth's biosphere, left by creatures too small to see, but powerful enough to leave marks that lasted 500 million years. Microbial mats didn't just live along the shore, they also thrived in tidal pools and shallow lagoons. When the water evaporated, salt crystals grew around them, preserving their shapes. Sometimes, they trapped bubbles of gas or grains of sand, creating small, dome-shaped structures called stromatolites, nature's oldest living fossils. Even now, stromatolites still exist in places like Shark Bay, Australia, nearly unchanged since the Cambrian. They are direct descendants of those early mats, living relics of a time when slime ruled the continents. But these mats weren't alone forever. As evolution advanced in the seas, tiny creatures began to crawl out of the water: worms, arthropods, and other early explorers of land. They left faint trackways across the microbial mats, pressing their bodies into the soft film as they moved. Fossils of these trails have been found in ancient rocks, showing the earliest interactions between animals and land. The mats fed them, held moisture for them, and probably gave them their first shelter. Without these microbial pioneers, the leap from sea to land might have taken millions of years longer. Over time, as oxygen continued to build in the atmosphere, the conditions on land became more stable. The mats helped slow erosion, reduced dust storms, and even influenced rainfall patterns. They made the continents more hospitable, setting the stage for the first true plants that would arrive tens of millions of years later. If you stood on one of those old beaches, there would be no trees, grass, or animals in sight. Instead, there would be rippled stone, small pools, and green slime that sparkled in the sun. While it may look empty, it was actually the start of everything. Those wet, rough areas were Earth's first living skin. They were a thin film that changed rock into soil and sunshine into oxygen. Earth's geography, a supercontinent called Gondwana. 520 million years ago, the continents were not at all like they are now. The world map would not have been easy to understand because it did not show common shapes like Africa or Asia. Most of the Earth's land was joined together to form a huge supercontinent called Gondwana. It was a huge southern world that went from the South Pole to the tropics. A few smaller continents, such as Laurentia, which would later become North America, Baltica, Northern Europe, and Siberia, moved around it slowly through warm, shallow water. From space, Gondwana would have looked like a rusty orange giant surrounded by turquoise water. Its surface was barren. No green, no forests, just windswept plains of sand and bare rock. Huge deserts stretched across its center, while the coastlines were fringed with tidal flats, lagoons, and patches of microbial mats. These slimy green mats were the closest thing to life on land at the time. The real action, however, was in the shallow waters surrounding it, where the Cambrian explosion was transforming simple seas into complex ecosystems. The atmosphere was thick with carbon dioxide, making the planet hot and humid. Temperatures near the equator were high, and even polar regions were warmer than today's temperate zones. There were no ice caps yet, just open ocean and steamy coastlines. Winds carried iron-rich dust from the dry interior of Gondwana and dropped it into the sea, turning the coastal waters a rusty red. These minerals fed algae and bacteria, boosting photosynthesis and helping oxygen spread through the oceans. But Gondwana wasn't alone. To the north, the smaller continents of Laurentia and Baltica drifted like islands across a global ocean called Panthalassa, the ancestor of the Pacific. Between them lay another sea, the Iapetus Ocean, where coral-like organisms and sponges were beginning to build the first primitive reefs. Volcanoes dotted the seafloor, releasing gases and minerals that helped fuel life. Beneath the waves, tectonic plates were already reshaping the planet, slowly moving continents toward their future positions. Life in the oceans around Gondwana was thriving. The continental shelves, The shallow zones where sunlight reached the sea floor were hotspots of biodiversity. Trilobites scuttled across sandy bottoms. Filter-feeding worms waved frilly tentacles in the current, and in the open water, predators like Anomalocaris hunted freely. Fossils from regions that were once part of Gondwana, such as Australia, Antarctica, and South America, show that these areas were teeming with early marine life. It was in these warm coastal zones that many of the Cambrian's strangest creatures evolved and flourished. Geologically, Gondwana was still young. Mountains were low, carved down by millions of years of erosion, and volcanoes dotted its edges. Rivers wound through valleys of bare stone, carrying sediment to the sea where it settled in layers. Over time, these sediments would harden into rocks that still exist today, the ancient foundations of continents we now live on. The planet's crust was constantly moving, but at a slow, steady pace, like an ancient heartbeat. It's astounding that the way these continents are arranged also had an effect on development. Gondwana was very big and covered a lot of different temperature zones, so it made a lot of different settings, from dry deserts in the middle to wet tropical coasts. This made it possible for different species to develop separately, which led to variety in different areas, even in the early stages of complex life. Some scientists think that the range of animals helped speed up the Cambrian explosion because they were able to adapt to their new environments in very different ways. If you could walk across Gondwana, the landscape would feel alien. The air would sting your lungs from lack of oxygen. The ground would be cracked and red with iron dust. You might see ripples on the surface of the rock, ancient marks left by waves or microbial mats, long since turned to stone, and in the distance, you'd hear nothing but wind. But step into the nearby sea, and the silence would vanish, replaced by motion, color, and life. Over the next few 100 million years, Gondwana would slowly drift, collide, and split. It would form the heart of future continents: Africa, South America, Antarctica, India, and Australia, before finally breaking apart during the age of dinosaurs. But during the Cambrian, it was still whole, a single, sun-baked landmass surrounded by the planet's first complex ecosystems. The shallow reef builders. Before coral reefs made tropical seas into underwater cities, there were simple organisms that looked like sponges and groups of algae that built the first reefs. These organisms and algae laid the groundwork for the ocean ecosystems we know today. During the Cambrian period, 520 million years ago, these reefs didn't look at all like the bright coral formations we see today. They were small, bumpy peaks that rose only a few feet above the water. But these small, unstable mounds were groundbreaking because they were the first homes that living things built to stay in. In the warm, sunlit shallows surrounding Gondwana and the smaller continents, conditions were perfect. The seas were calm, oxygen-rich, and full of minerals like calcium and silica, ingredients that early reef builders could use to strengthen their bodies. The first reef architects were archaeocyathids, strange, sponge-like animals with cone-shaped skeletons made of calcium carbonate. They had walls filled with tiny holes that allowed water to flow through, filtering nutrients as they fed. When many archaeocyathids grew together, their skeletons fused into low, porous mounds. Over generations, these mounds solidified, forming the first reefs in Earth's history. To modern eyes, they wouldn't look impressive, more like bumpy hills than living walls. But for the creatures of the Cambrian, they were bustling neighborhoods. The holes and ridges of these early reefs created hiding places for tiny worms, crustacean-like animals, and soft-bodied creatures that couldn't survive on open sand. They offered shelter from predators like Anomalocaris and provided hard surfaces for algae to attach and grow. These early reef systems became miniature ecosystems, full of light, movement, and color. Alongside the archaeocyathids, cyanobacteria and algae were also key builders. They formed thick layers of lime-rich sediment known as stromatolites, which grew upward towards sunlight. In some places, stromatolites and archaeocyathids combined to create hybrid reefs, part sponge, part bacterial mat. These formations dotted the shallow shelves of ancient oceans, forming ribbons and clusters that stretched for miles. They were nature's first experiments in construction, laying the groundwork, literally, for future reef ecosystems. Scientists studying fossils of these early reefs have discovered intricate details of their structure, In thin rock slices viewed under a microscope, you can see the fine latticework of the archaeocyanthid skeletons still holding their shape after 500 million years. Some show signs of damage and regrowth, proof that even then life was constantly adapting to stress, repairing itself, and starting over. These ancient reef builders had short lifespans, but long-lasting impact. The rise of reefs changed everything about the ocean environment. They stabilized coastlines by trapping sediment, prevented erosion, and created new habitats for other species. They also helped regulate the chemistry of seawater, locking away carbon dioxide in their calcium carbonate skeletons. In a way, they were the planet's first environmental engineers, transforming both the seafloor and the atmosphere in slow, steady cycles. But the early reef boom didn't last forever. Around 515 million years ago, changing ocean chemistry and competition from other sponge species led to the decline of archaeocyathids. Their reign as dominant reef builders lasted only about 10 million years, a short chapter in Earth's timeline. After they disappeared, it would take tens of millions of years before corals and other organisms took over their role. Still, their influence never truly vanished. Every modern reef, from the Caribbean to the Great Barrier Reef, traces its ancestry back to these simple pioneers. If you could dive into one of these Cambrian reefs, the view would be breathtaking in its own quiet way. The water would be clear and warm, filled with tiny particles of calcium glittering in the sunlight. The reef mounds would rise gently from the seabed, their surfaces covered in sponges, algae, and crawling creatures. You might see trilobites moving between gaps, small worms waving feathery appendages to catch food, and colorful bacterial mats growing over dead skeletons. There were no corals, no fish, but there was life, busy and thriving, building the foundation of ecosystems that would last for hundreds of millions of years. Underwater ambush predators. By the middle of the Cambrian period, the seas were like a war zone. As quickly as eyes, armor, and speed improved, some creatures changed their strategy. They stopped following and began to wait. These were the first animals to learn that being patient could be just as dangerous as being strong. When they saw something swimming too close, they would strike. Instead of swimming after their food, they hid in the sand or soft mud. It was the first time evolution tried to be sneaky and surprise something. The seafloor during this time wasn't empty, it was alive with movement. Tiny worms wriggled through sediment, trilobites crawled along the mud, and plankton drifted down like snow. For an animal smart enough to stay still, food came to it. Some early arthropods, distant relatives of crabs and insects, began to burrow halfway into the seabed, exposing only their eyes or antennae. Others flattened their bodies completely, pressing against the ocean floor until they were almost invisible. They waited, motionless, until their prey brushed against them, and then they lunged. The Wheeler Formation in what is now Utah has some of the most peculiar examples. Fossils there show that early arthropods made V-shaped marks in the mud. The marks show that the animals hid just below the surface and would jump up when they were scared. Because they were meant to grip, not run, their long, hooked limbs were strong enough to cut soft skin. Even though they didn't have jaws, their lips and claws were very sharp and could tear smaller animals apart. They learned how to be still in a world where everything else was learning to move. Flatworms too joined the ambush game. These simple, soft-bodied animals had no skeletons or shells, but their bodies were perfectly suited for hiding. Some had light-sensitive patches on their backs, allowing them to detect shadows overhead. When something blocked the light, they'd rise slightly, ready to strike. They fed on smaller worms and plankton that wandered too close. Though primitive, they represented one of life's first examples of sensory-triggered behavior, a biological trap set in motion by light and shadow. Trilobites weren't safe either. Fossil evidence shows that many species bore scars and bite marks consistent with attacks from below. Predators like Sydnea, a small arthropod with grasping limbs and a crushing mouth, likely ambushed prey along sandy slopes. Sydnea would bury itself in soft sediment, waiting until vibrations or chemical cues signaled a target above. When it attacked, it used its spined legs to grab and crush prey before dragging it beneath the sand. This style of hunting changed the dynamics of the Cambrian seas. Prey animals could no longer rely on simply spotting a predator in time. Danger now came from the ground itself. As a result, many species evolved new defenses. Trilobites developed tougher exoskeletons and learned to burrow themselves. Worms became more agile, able to twist away from sudden attacks. Some species even began to live higher above the sea floor, clinging to rocks or reefs where ambush predators couldn't reach them. Scientists studying the fossilized seafloor of places like the Burgess Shale and Chengjiang have found delicate traces of these ancient behaviors. Grooves, pits, and tunnels that show how early predators moved and hid. These aren't body fossils, but trace fossils, the preserved evidence of activity. They reveal that hunting strategy, one of the most advanced behaviors in the modern animal kingdom, began with creatures no larger than your finger. The rise of ambush predators also had a ripple effect on the ecosystem. As more species began hiding and burrowing, the seafloor itself changed. Sediment became softer and more oxygenated because animals were constantly stirring it up. This created new habitats and allowed even more species to evolve. Filter feeders, scavengers, and grazers that took advantage of the disturbed mud. In a sense, predators weren't just shaping evolution through fear, they were physically reshaping the environment itself. If you could dive into one of those shallow Cambrian seas and watch quietly, you'd see almost nothing at first. The sand would look still, the water clear. Then, out of nowhere, the seabed would move. A ripple of motion, a flash of spines, and a struggling prey pulled below the surface. Within seconds, the sand would settle again, erasing all evidence. They were the first hunters to learn how to be patient and use the seafloor as a weapon. They taught evolution that power didn't always mean being fast or big. Sometimes it meant waiting for the right time to attack. They were very still, but that silence led to strategy. And from strategy came the constant tension between hunter and prey that still defines life today. The slow march onto land. For billions of years, there was no sound on Earth's continents. There were waves, winds, and rain on red plains and bare rock, but nothing moved. Then, sometime after 520 million years ago, something very strange took place. Small animals with soft bodies started to crawl out of the water and make the first faint tracks on land. It was the start of a change that would eventually bring forests, animals, and people to all continents. But at this early stage, the first animals to explore were simple ones, worms and other small arthropods. They did so slowly, because no animal had ever been there before. At first, it wasn't a dramatic invasion. These creatures didn't live permanently on land. They likely came up only for short moments, maybe chasing food, escaping predators, or following moisture left by retreating tides. The coastlines were lined with microbial mats, those slippery layers of bacteria that held dampness and nutrients. For an animal used to crawling through mud, these mats felt familiar. They were soft, wet, and full of microscopic food. And most importantly, they didn't dry out right away. Fossil evidence of these first explorers comes in the form of trackways, shallow winding lines pressed into ancient rocks that were once tidal flats. In Newfoundland, scientists discovered some of the oldest known land track fossils, about 510 million years old. The patterns show multiple paired impressions, suggesting a small, many-legged creature crawling slowly forward before turning back toward the sea. There were no footprints, only shallow grooves, proof that these animals had soft bodies and probably exoskeletons too fragile to fossilize. Who were these brave pioneers? Most researchers believe they were early arthropods, relatives of trilobites and centipedes. Their bodies were covered with flexible shells, and their legs could support them for short distances on solid ground. Some may have been small crustaceans that ventured ashore during high tides. Others were worm-like animals that followed moisture lines and algae growing along the shore. Whatever their identity, their short trips onto land marked the start of one of evolution's most important journeys, the move from water to air. Life on land was harsh. There was no shade, no plants, and no soil, only sand, rock, and dust. The sun's ultraviolet rays were deadly, the air was dry, and the temperature swung wildly between day and night. Every step was dangerous. These animals had to keep their bodies wet to breathe. Many probably suffocated or dried out within minutes. Still, evolution was experimenting. A few species developed thicker exoskeletons to hold in moisture. while others learned to burrow beneath microbial mats to stay cool. The rewards for these early explorers were worth the risk. There were no predators on land, no competition, and plenty of untouched food. Dead algae, bacteria, and organic debris washed up from the sea. For small scavengers, it was a buffet waiting to be discovered. And every time one crawled a little farther inland, evolution learned something new about how to survive outside the water. Over millions of years, these experiments slowly shaped anatomy. Limbs grew stronger. Respiratory systems adapted to absorb oxygen from air instead of water. Some creatures began laying eggs in damp sand instead of underwater, protecting them from marine predators. Each tiny change added up, bringing life one step closer to permanent colonization. Even the surface of the land began to change. The microbial mats that had once ruled the coastlines became trampled and stirred by crawling animals, mixing sediments and releasing nutrients. This process helped create the first thin layers of soil, an early primitive ground where future plants would take root. The relationship between life and land had officially begun. The slow march onto land wasn't just one thing, it was a bunch of tests. Every generation learned a little more, stayed a little longer, and crawled a little further. Those first arthropods and worms were changing the world forever, but they didn't know it. 70 million years later, what started as a careful crawl would turn into trees, insects, reptiles, and people. It all began with a few brave steps on a calm beach. Storms over a young world. During the Cambrian period, Earth was wild and restless. It was still learning how to keep its oceans, air, and heat in balance. The weather was wild because there were no trees or plants to hold the ground down or woods to calm the winds. The air was thick with carbon dioxide. The sun was very bright, and the sky was cloudy. The land was changed by the storms, not just covered by them. Rain and wind made marks on the empty continents, and small seas with each storm. Because there were no trees or grass, nothing stopped water from rushing across the ground. When the air grew hot and the pressure shifted, giant storm systems formed over the young oceans. They built up strength for days, then slammed into Gondwana's coastlines with walls of wind and rain. Torrents of muddy water poured into the sea, washing minerals and sediments far out into the shallows. These materials became food for plankton and algae, turning calm blue waters into murky, nutrient-rich green. Lightning strikes were common, millions of volts dancing through the thick atmosphere, flashing across horizons that had never known fire. Each bolt split molecules of nitrogen in the air, turning them into compounds that fertilized the oceans below. The storms didn't just destroy, they fed life. Every flash of lightning delivered the ingredients that fueled the earliest food chains. The shallow Cambrian seas were especially vulnerable. Storm surges and underwater landslides swept across continental shelves, stirring up sand and silt. Trilobites were often buried alive, their bodies perfectly preserved in the layers they once crawled over. Some fossils show entire communities of sea creatures frozen mid-motion, caught and entombed by sudden sediment flows triggered by storms. For paleontologists, these moments became windows into ancient life, snapshots taken in the middle of catastrophe. The atmosphere itself was unstable. With higher levels of greenhouse gases, the climate was warmer than today's tropics. But without plants to absorb carbon dioxide, heat built up and circulated unevenly. Air currents roared across continents, lifting fine dust from the land and spreading it for thousands of miles. This iron-rich dust fell into the oceans, feeding blooms of microorganisms that pumped out even more oxygen, a cycle of chaos and creation. In some regions, scientists believed the storms were so intense that they generated megawaves, tsunamis hundreds of feet high caused by undersea landslides or collapsing cliffs. These waves crashed against Gondwana's shores, flattening microbial mats and erasing coastlines overnight. Each storm rearranged the landscape, constantly reshaping where rivers flowed and where sediment settled. For the small creatures living in these shallow waters, every storm was a test of survival. Trilobites clung to the seabed or burrowed deep into the mud, hoping to wait out the currents. Soft-bodied animals like Wiwaxia and Hallucigenia were tossed and scattered by the waves. Some didn't survive, but others used the aftermath to their advantage. When the waters calmed, new layers of sediment created fresh habitats, full of food and space to grow. Life adapted not by resisting the storms, but by rebuilding after them. Fossil evidence shows alternating layers of fine sediment and coarse debris in Cambrian rocks, suggesting a rhythm of destruction and renewal. Each layer tells the same story. The seas rose, the storms hit, life recovered, and evolution pressed on. The chaos of the weather didn't stop the expansion of life. It fueled it. You could see one of these old storms from the shore and be safe. It would be like seeing the earth breathe fire and water at the same time. Volcanic dust would make the clouds thick and orange as they came in. The ground would shake from the thunder that would echo for miles. The salty air would taste like metal, and the waves would hit the rocky rocks. Then, when the storm was over, there would be quiet again, broken only by the slow movement of things crawling back to life under the water. At that time, the Cambrian world was still young, unstable, and full of life. You could say that its storms were both destructive and helpful to Earth's growth. No matter how loud or small, every lightning strike, wave, or flood held the seeds of evolution. The weather wasn't different from life. It was one of the best teachers, teaching even the tiniest beings that the only way to stay alive was to learn how to deal with change. The legacy of the Cambrian seas. Earth wasn't the same place it was a few million years ago when the Cambrian period ended. The world of rocks and microbes had turned into a live lab in the ocean, full of color, movement, and new ideas. Almost every animal species we know of today got its start in those seas. In a way, the Cambrian wasn't just a part of history. It was the start of all the animals that would crawl, swim, and walk on Earth. Every modern creature, from whales to beetles to humans, can trace its ancestry back to that era. The first eyes, muscles, jaws, shells, and legs all appeared here. Even the earliest nervous systems, the biological spark that allowed animals to sense the world around them, were tested in those shallow waters. The Cambrian seas were like an evolutionary explosion of ideas, where nature experimented without fear of failure. Some designs, like Hallucigenia's spines or Opabinia's 5 eyes, disappeared forever. Others, like Morella's jointed limbs or Anomalocaris's complex eyes, became the foundation for all future life. Trilobites, the most common animals of their time, spread to every ocean. They dug through sediment, grazed on algae, and became the planet's first ecosystem engineers. When they burrowed, they mixed oxygen into the seabed, helping bacteria thrive and creating stable environments for smaller creatures. Their success showed that complexity wasn't just about size or strength, it was about balance. And for nearly 270 million years, their descendants would rule the seas until long after the Cambrian ended. The impact of the Cambrian seas stretched far beyond biology. They reshaped Earth's chemistry and geology too. The early reef builders, like archaeocyathids and cyanobacteria, locked carbon dioxide into stone, slowly cooling the planet's climate. Oxygen levels rose to new heights, paving the way for future bursts of life. The ocean's circulation patterns changed, carrying nutrients to deeper layers and expanding habitats. By the end of the period, Earth had evolved from a reactive world into a self-sustaining system, one where life shaped the planet as much as the planet shaped life. But not all was stable. With new life came new vulnerability. Many Cambrian species lived close to the edge, specialized, fragile, and unable to adapt when environments shifted. Minor changes in oxygen or temperature could wipe out entire groups. And they did. Several smaller extinction events punctuated the Cambrian, quietly pruning the tree of life and clearing space for what would come next, the Ordovician period, where the first fish and true reefs would rise. Still, the Cambrian world left behind a fossil record so rich and detailed that it's often called the Rosetta Stone of evolution. Places like the Burgess Shale in Canada and the Chengjiang site in China are more than just dig sites. They are time capsules, preserving not just bones or shells, but the very outlines of soft tissue, eyes, and organs. Under the microscope, paleontologists can still see gills, stomachs, and even nerve cords, the anatomy of the world's first complex animals, frozen in stone. When you look at those fossils today, you're looking at the roots of your own existence. The way you see, breathe, and move can all be traced back to traits first developed in those Cambrian oceans. The human nervous system, for example, shares its basic design with the first simple nerve cords, that guided tiny swimming worms. The segmented muscles in our arms and legs echo the structure of arthropods like Morella. The story of the Cambrian isn't distant or irrelevant. It's written inside every living thing on Earth. If you could stand on the edge of a Cambrian sea as the sun rose, you'd see a world in motion. The water would shimmer with life, trilobites marching across sand, sponges filtering light through their pores, Anomalocaris gliding silently above the reef. Each ripple, each flicker of movement would carry a piece of the future, from a silent, rocky planet to an ocean bursting with life. Earth's transformation during the Cambrian changed everything. The first eyes, muscles, and brains appeared here, and from them came every creature that would ever swim, crawl, or walk. Those ancient seas were the spark that made our world alive, and their legacy still flows through every heartbeat on Earth today. If you enjoyed this journey through the planet's earliest oceans, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us, because next time we're diving even deeper into the forgotten ages that built the world we know.